Dr. Dempsey, we are live.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Evans. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the October 13th, 2022 monthly meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This Standards Commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation programs. I am Van Dempsey, Chair of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the e-board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of the conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussions on the matter and from voting on the matter. You have the agenda for today's meeting, and you have had an opportunity to review it. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda for the October 13th, 2022 meeting?
So moved, Anthony Grant.
Thank you, Dr. Grant.
Second, Connie.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. The minutes from our previous commission meeting on September the 8th, 2022 are available and have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
This
is Catherine, so moved.
We have a motion to approve. Did I hear a second?
This is Randy, I'll second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? Now Dr. Evans will present the NCDPI and state board updates. Ms. Evans, Dr. Evans, I'm sorry.
Sure. Morning, everyone. To start out with, the first update is about the Pepsi report. It went for discussion during the October state board meeting, and it will go for action during the November state board meeting. And then our second update is around principal preparation recommendations. Sorry about that. And so these recommendations, can everyone see the PowerPoint okay? I'm assuming we can.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So the first recommendation, as you know, they discuss the licensure exam requirement that's already in statute. And so they recommended that there'll be an alternative evidence-based portfolio as defined by the State Board of Education, along with the licensure exam requirement. And those would be two options that principal candidates would be able to fulfill to complete this exam requirement. So that's one of the recommendations. The second recommendation is around internship, that to remove year-long from the definition of internship, and this would allow more flexibility as to how to define what internship means and then allow the State Board of Education and DPI to adopt an evidence-based framework to guide the development of the school administrator internship. And then for work experience, what it says in statute right now is at least 4 years of classroom teaching experience. And what was recommended was substitute the definition of teacher to include student service personnel such as social workers, media specialists, and school counselors, and then also allow student service personnel, in addition to classroom teachers, to also be eligible for a principal's license or administrator's license.
Dr. Evans, if I can interrupt for a
Yes.
second. We got a message, the live stream may not be working.
Okay. Let me check on that. Hold on just a second. Is it the sound or it's just not live streaming at all, Dr. Dempsey?
I'm not sure which one it is.
Yeah, I received the same message from someone as well, and they're just saying the public link is not working.
Oh, let me check. It looks like it is live right now.
Thank you, Dr.
They might need to refresh. So tell them to refresh, and maybe the link would pop up.
And I also just got to know, it is working from YouTube.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. And then the last piece was the master's degree. And right now in statute, principal candidates would need to have at least a master's degree in education administration. And what was recommended by the state board was to require an administrator to have either a master's degree in school administration or the add-on certificate for the principal's license, which then included that they possess a master's degree in an education-related field. So that candidate would have a master's degree, but not necessarily in education administration. And so just as a reminder, these 4 areas, this recommendation around principal preparation would be sent to the General Assembly for consideration, and it is up to them whether they make those changes within statute. But those were the recommendations around principal licensure. Any questions? And those are the two. Those are the two reviews for State Board this month.
Thank you, Dr. Evans.
Sure.
If there
Dr.
are,
Evans. I'm sorry, Dr. Dempsey, I have one question for Dr. Evans.
sure.
Sure.
Dr. Evans, in the statute, is there any mention of like the quality of the person who's pursuing the degree? And what I mean by that is we tend to confuse, length of time in a profession and equate that to impact or quality. And I don't see anything in the statute that says that the person had to have been a good teacher or an effective student services personnel. Any mention of that in the statute at all?
That is a great question, Dr. Graham, and that is not in statute. However, what was discussed around quality was quality of the internship and figuring out a better framework for that to then help with better preparation around what can go on during that internship to then help to produce a better quality principals out there in North Carolina. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans, I inadvertently jumped over the roll call, so could we go back and call the roll for the meeting?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Apologies for that.
No problem. Dr. Blanton?
Present.
Dr. Bullock? Dr. Dempsey?
Present.
Dr. Fleming?
Present.
Miss Edwards?
Present.
Dr. Graham?
Present.
Dr. Houston? Dr. Locklear?
Here.
Dr. Marr?
Present.
Dr. Elliott?
Present.
Dr. Penfield?
Present.
Superintendent Truitt?
Present.
Miss Carper? Miss Carper, I think you're having some problems with audio. I think that's correct. But I believe Miss Carper is here. Dr.
She is.
Holland? Thank you. Dr.
Here.
Holland? Dr. Weddington? Dr. Griffin?
Here.
Mr. Smith?
Present.
Mr. Patton? We have quorum.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Evans.
No problem.
Next, I will present the updated draft of the North Carolina Professional Pathways to Excellence for Teaching Professionals for discussion by the commission. And while Dr. Evans brings that document up, I'd like to recommend a process for doing this with the time we have available. First, to review the revised draft as we did in the September meeting, to go through it one section at a time. And if people have questions for clarity, that we answer clarifying questions that can help commission members with review of the document. And then after we have gone through the document, to come back to discussion items or items for deliberation that may still be present in the draft, and to make sure we have adequate time to do that. If you will go ahead and go to the second slide, Dr. Evans. There are a set of items that you see on the screen right now, which are items that were discussed at the September meeting to either attempt to write the language more clearly or to go back to the co-chairs to make sure we had resolved any unclear components or discrepancies in the particular recommendation item that is in the draft. So what I would like to do, if this serves the purpose, these items we will see as we go through the revised draft. I would like, after we have gone through the revised draft, to come back to this list first to clear from the list any items that have been resolved in the draft or that we can dispense with in short order given agreement or consensus about the item. And then we will, as we did in September, engage in a discussion about clarifying and being clear in our intent as a commission about the language that we have in the draft. So if that is acceptable to the group and there are no objections, we'll move forward accordingly. So Dr. Evans, if you would go ahead and go to the next slide. And if we have clarifying questions about the language that is there, please let us know. I will attempt to follow the chat as well. If there are no questions, Dr. Evans, if you would go to the next slide.
Dr. Dempsey,
Yes,
I'm sorry, I raised my hand, but could we back up one slide?
we sure can.
Can someone explain the switch from would to could? I think I know, but I want to make sure someone else can articulate it for me.
It really connects to 2 points that we asked the co-chairs of preparation and entry and licensure to discuss. That was part of the discussion that we had. Dr. Bullock was not able to make the meeting today. The 2 sort of pieces of this. One is what the intention of the ITSP is and what is the language that we want to use to describe that. And depending on that language, which you'll see come up in a couple of other locations, that it is a resource to be used versus a mandate for a particular piece. I think Dr. Evans was in that meeting, if I am misrepresenting or forgot major components of that. It was for the word to be less indicative of a particular component or requirement, and to speak more generally to supporting new teachers in the early stages of their career.
Thank you.
Dr. Locklear has her hand raised.
Yes.
Yes, hi, thank you. Going back, and I was just trying to internalize all of this. I know we're going through the slides, so I should have asked this question earlier. But going back to license 1, I don't know if we got there, but the salary, and I'm just trying to figure out how will each district have enough advanced teachers to support the license 1 teachers? Or have we thought about that? How are we going to support all of these individuals? Because, some districts can't even fill their classrooms.
Right. Can we hold that question? We'll get on license 1 in just a second. Can we hold that question?
Okay, that's fine. And I'm sorry, I may have jumped the gun. I apologize.
Not a problem at all. I do want to point out in that first bullet, the question, does this mean 3 consecutive 1-year licenses? It is my understanding that you can hold an apprentice license for 3 years, and that is 3 1-year licenses. It is not a 3-year license. That we also discussed that across preparation, entry, and licensure. The answer to that question, does this mean 3 consecutive 1-year licenses? My understanding is yes. And Dr. Evans, if you could back up for 1 second. The reference to the Federal Register or not, that is a reference, I'm understanding that as a reference to the U.S. Department of Labor definition of an apprentice, and how what North Carolina might do with the apprentice license would connect to that U.S. Department of Labor and ultimately North Carolina. Is that the intent of that note when it says Federal Registered?
I'm sorry, Dr. Dempsey, are you asking me that question?
Well, or people from the subcommittee from which that emerged, because I think we can resolve that question, that note is a reference to when it says Federal Register, the U.S. Department of Labor definition of what an apprenticeship is, and that could be then interconnected with what apprenticeship means in the model.
So that is correct. That's something that's been under consideration. And so Catherine Costellos, who oversees apprenticeships to community colleges, for the community colleges, she came and spoke to one of the subcommittees, and they were considering that as part of the model.
Okay. You remember which subcommittee that was? Was it licensure?
It may have been licensure.
Yeah.
I think it was licensure.
Okay. We'll check on that. So I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide. The third bullet under requirements, that recommendation component is also in the list of items at the beginning of the presentation. So that is one of the items we will come back to. The next slide. I think in the third bullet, the license 2, is that a typo? That where it says license 1, license 2, is that it? Is that supposed to be license 1?
It's showing that these requirements would get you to license 2.
Okay.
That's what it's referring to.
This is Catherine. I have a question.
Yes.
So I noticed in all of these slides, there's the addition of if unable to meet requirements for license 2 or 3, that the next level, that is it still there? That the candidate could would qualify for a classified position. So why wouldn't it go back to an apprentice position, which pays more than a classified position? If we're creating a hierarchy of licensure here, then why would it seems that being an apprentice teacher, which is a salaried position as opposed to an hourly wage, would be preferable.
So, Dr. Dempsey, did you want to answer that?
My understanding from the subcommittee discussions is that if a person was at license 1, license 2, or license 3, the what came out of the subcommittee, I think license was that a person, for example, in license 2 could not go back to license 1. A person could go back to a TA position, and that would keep them in a classroom to be able to clear or resolve whatever the issues might have been. And folks from DPI who sat in all of the subcommittee meetings, that's what I remember from that discussion. But it certainly is an important question.
So, and can I also add something, Dr. Dempsey?
Please.
So also for this classified TA position, this is if they're not able to meet those requirements for to get to a license 2, then they could go back, they could become a classified TA, because you can't move backwards in the model. So then their license would have expired, but they could still try to fulfill their requirements to then get back on track to a license 2. Does that make sense, Superintendent Truitt?
Well, I understand the logic of not moving backward in the model, but if you are, but it seems like we're playing a game where if you don't get the jackpot, you go all the way back to start, and that does not make sense to me.
So it's just like now, if your license expires and you need to be reissued, say a CPL, you would have to have your 8 CEUs before you could be reissued the CPL.
Right, but as we progress through these slides, what we're going to find, at least the last time I looked at these slides, is that they all say, if you don't meet the requirements, you can become a classified TA.
And Superintendent Truitt, I don't want to put a recommendation in your. I can tell you what the recommendation should be, but your question, if I interpret it correctly, suggests that when we have a person who's in this situation, the recommendation should allow for going back to an apprentice identification.
Correct.
And clear the license issues from that appointment, not from a TA.
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to put that in the to be discussed column and note that.
And if I may, Dr. Dempsey, to add to Superintendent Truitt's comments, with respect to specifying on these slides that these individuals could go back to TA, these individuals could also go back to be a secretary or a custodian or a bus driver. So I don't know that that even needs to be included. If they're unable to meet requirements, they're unable to meet requirements. And if there's an option in the recommendation for them to go back to a different license type of position, such as the apprentice, then that certainly should be included. But I don't know that we, in looking at teacher licensure roles, should be looking at any kind of reference to what they may be able to apply for otherwise in a district or classified. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, it does. Can I ask people, for the moment, the question has been raised about the clarification of that recommendation component, which is noted, and Dr. Evans, I'm sure, has noted it. We can come back to that for discussion. It'll become part of that list from the opening of the presentation. It is to be resolved.
Dr. Dempsey, one quick question.
Yes, sir.
On the previous slide, it says that the license is 2 or 3 years. Which one is it? Is it up to 3 years or?
Go ahead, Dr. Dempsey.
I'm sorry. Thank you for noting that, because the two subcommittees discussed that. The recommendation out of the co-chairs was that the license, that we should go with 2 years.
Okay.
That has to be confirmed, but that was what came out of the discussions across prep and entry and licensure.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, I hadn't noted that. Dr. Evans, were you going to add to that?
No, I was just going to say it's on our list of agenda items.
Right. Okay. License 2 section.
Dr. Dempsey, one quick question for me on license 2.
Yes.
I raised this in one of our subcommittee chair meetings, about the micro-credentialing. I'm still not entirely clear on the micro-credentialing piece. Who's responsible for the micro-credentialing? As I expressed some months ago, and I'm biased and I acknowledge my subjectivity up front, I'd like to see more emphasis on our educator preparation programs being involved with the micro-credentialing, if that's a direction we're going to go, based on evidence that we have of our ed prep programs producing quality classroom teachers for the state of North Carolina. So I'm just not 100% clear on the micro-credentialing and who's responsible for developing and designing and executing and so forth.
Right. That is on the action item list. It's a very important question, and Ann Bullock as co-chair and I discussed that. when we were working across the two subcommittees a couple of weeks ago. So we will come back to that, Dr. Graham, in the action item list.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Evans, can you back up for 1 second? I want to point out that middle, well, actually, where it has strike through or complete one of, and then you'll see the language tools designed. That was attempting to resolve questions that came up in significant, we spent some time discussing it in the September meeting. This strategy that was zero in on one indicator versus the teacher in the particular license should have a portfolio of choices and evidence, and there would be multiple ways to show evidence of practice at that license level. And so that's why you see language that is using the following tools as an effort to, one, use different language, and two, clarify that. And then Dr. Evans, it's noted at the bottom of this slide, all measures are validated for all intended purposes, and the language disappears. That asterisk is in part a response to the question that came up in September about reliable and valid tools. Am I correct on that?
That is correct.
Dr. Dempsey, I have a clarifying question about these requirements. So the idea here is that teachers are meeting a range of these requirements, like you just said, creating like a portfolio of some sort that shows meeting the various pieces, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So when we get into looking at like bringing in the EVOS data, those teachers that don't have the ability to receive EVOS data, are they then just required to be able to show data from the other spots more like focused?
At least in the draft form that it's in right now, the intent of the language, again, that we discussed in trying to clarify this, was to open up those options and to make sure that the evidence that was provided answered the question about the person's practice-based capacity to hold that license. Were they exhibiting the evidence? And then you see after the using the following tools that it becomes less a pick one. And the intent was to be less pick one and more use the tools that are adequate to providing the evidence of mastery.
Okay.
That's the intent. I think I'm speaking for Dr. Bullock fairly. That is the intent of that change.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Dr. Evans. The next two slides, I don't believe have any changes from the September meeting. This is language that explains basically what a micro-credential is and how they could be used. Dr. Evans, I'm sorry to ask you to do this. Could you go back to slide 6 for just a second? I want to pick up on something there that I think will be informative to other questions. And for example, the one Dr. Graham asked a second ago, the bullet under the supports section 1, 2, 3, the fourth one, the assumption in the license 1 and license 2 levels is that there is an MOU between the public school unit and the EPP, an affiliated EPP, in partnership that is structuring what these requirements and supports, how the requirements would be met and what the supports for that would be. And I just wanted to point out that bullet was in the September version. That bullet has not changed. That's a question that has come up between meetings to me. Questions that have been directed to me. I just wanted to point that bullet out. Now, I'm sorry for...
Dr. Dempsey, can I ask a question on that slide?
Yes.
Based on that?
Yes.
So if there's an MOU that's required, should the third bullet must be affiliated with an EPP and PSU that guides routing?
You mean the third at the top?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is, we need to clarify. Dr. Evans, I think that is in the action item list. There are two different intents in those 2 points. One is to give more flexibility to how a person in license 1 and license 2 begins the process of achieving the license as compared to what happens now, which is the person's hired by a school district and it's a highly compressed process for that person to then identify an EPP. I believe, and Dr. Evans, correct me if I'm misrepresenting subcommittees, the intent of the must be affiliated is to give more flexibility in that time frame.
Okay.
I think. I want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
And it is for the purposes of establishing the affiliations. The fourth bullet in the second section under supports, the intention is to confirm the importance of the relationship between an EPP and the school district where the hiring has occurred.
Okay.
So we can, I appreciate you raising that question because I believe it is in our notes from the action items to clarify that third point under requirements. Dr. Evans, you can go back to the micro-credential slides 9 and 10. If there are no questions, we can go to 11.
Dr. Dempsey, this is Randy. I have a question about the second bullet point. Meets expected growth for EVOS score. And I'm curious, is it, that seems pretty wide open. Like, could you have met expected growth in any 1 year in any given subject? I'm wondering whether there was specificity as to when that would have to happen.
I'm looking through upcoming slides. I don't believe that is specifically noted. Dr. Evans.
Say that again, Dr. Penfield. Sorry, I was going to call you Randy.
That's right. So the language right now is just meets expected growth for EVOS score. And so I think that I'm just curious whether the subcommittee had, whether there was an intention to put any bounds on that. Like, for example, is it just that you have to meet expected growth at one point in time, within 1 year, across any number of the years, that you had been the teacher of record? For the other ones, as we move up, in the pathway, it becomes a little more specific as to, exactly what it's asking for. And this one kind of seemed wide open. So I was just curious.
Thank you for raising that. I'm going sort of parallel to an earlier conversation. Can I translate your question into a recommendation that needs to be made explicit in the same way it is in license 4, for example? It made more sense.
Yes.
Yes. We need to be,
Yeah.
yes, thank you.
Dr. Dempsey,
Yeah, let me just say, Dr. Penfield, we'll attempt to parallel that language in the same way we have other recommendation components.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Okay. I think I interrupted somebody.
okay, Dr. Dempsey, this is Bill Griffin here. I had a question about that bullet point as well. With EVOS and growth, I believe there is some conversation with some meetings on testing reform and accountability. Would any of those conversations change the EVOS measures that we have, and how would that reflect within this model?
I'm going to say pragmatically, yes, that EVOS for now is a specific tool. I'm not making a recommendation. I'm following your question. It is a specific tool from which data can be drawn that speaks to the impact of the teacher's practice. If that tool were to change in the future, that the way that recommendation is phrased in future reference, it would be a reference to a different tool. If I'm answering your question.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where we're using a reference to a specific thing that is occurring right now. The intent of that is evidence from student data that informs the question, and EVOS happens to be the current state of practice in North Carolina. But yes, if EVOS changed, that would change.
And Dr. Dempsey, this is Maureen, if I could add one comment to that as well.
Yes.
Also, keep in mind that EVOS is looking only at growth. It is not looking at proficiency. And in some of the accountability changes that we're looking at, that one of the shifts would be to increase the amount of growth that's part of the accountability model, and not rely as heavily on proficiency. Right now, it's 80% proficiency, 20% growth. So one of the things they are looking at and changing that proficiency model or the accountability model is increasing the emphasis on the growth and decreasing the emphasis on the proficiency. And then also looking at other indicators of how well a school is doing, not just looking at standardized testing, which is part of the Pathways to Excellence we are also trying to do by de-emphasizing the relying strictly on standardized testing to determine a teacher's growth and giving other options or choices for teachers to demonstrate their ability to grow their students.
If there are no other questions, we can go to the next slide. Dr. Evans, you can go ahead and move to the next one. The categories and components information. The top, I believe, Dr. Evans, the top right cell, candidates must meet, and the bottom left cell, tools designed to measure impact on student learning, those are revisions from the original draft.
That is correct.
From the September draft.
Yes.
Okay. The attempt in those two is to speak to the question and recommendations from September around using the reference to tools to design to measure impact on student learning, which also is connected to the discussion we just had about EVOS specifically. And the top right one is a reference to the position that came out of the prep and entry subcommittee to use in-task as both the standards and progression model for how one moves through the licensure levels. The next slide, unless there are questions.
Dr. Dempsey, hey, this is Chris. Just to clarify, so the bottom left, where the tools designed to measure, is that aligned with slide 8, the last bullet, other reliable and valid qualitative and quantitative methods? Is that where that came from?
I'm going to ask Dr. Evans and Dr. Penfield to make sure I'm getting this correct. The reference on slide 8 is more broadly speaking to the tools that would be used, particularly in the middle, tools designed to measure impact on student learning / peer collegial review of practice. That the asterisk at the bottom, it connects with that recommendation. Is that correct, Dr. Evans and Dr. Penfield?
So the other reliable and valid or quantitative methods, that is leaving measures open for any other tools that are created that could serve that purpose. And then Dr. Penfield and I had discussed adding the all measures are validated for all intended purposes, and it's blocked out there. But so then that's for the measures that do exist right now, that the group wanted to make sure that things were being validated for all the intended purposes of whichever measures are being utilized for the model.
Thank you. And Dr. Penfield, if you'd like to clarify any words I just spoke on your behalf, please do so.
Thanks, Dr. Dempsey. I don't have anything else to clarify.
Okay, thank you.
This is Connie. May I ask a question, please?
Yes.
As it relates to the last question or the last comment, with the reliable and valid qualitative and quantitative methods, and I think Dr. Evans made mention to, and maybe I'm misinterpreting this, so I'm trying to get some clarity, pardon me, that would kind of be left with the districts. Is that what I'm hearing? Because if that's the case, how can we ensure that this model will be effective from district to district as teachers move from district to district, from school to school? How will that impact their growth? Will they have to start over? For instance, I may be in one district and that those reliable or qualitative methods that they're using in that district may be different than some that they're using in another district or in another school. How is that going to impact growth on this scale for teachers as they move from district to district, school to school?
Dr. Evans, I'll offer this. I do not believe that it was the intention of the subcommittees and the recommendation that be on a district by district basis. Although districts could have complementary tools, the reference to the reliable and valid qualitative or quantitative methods was speaking to the issue of the state of North Carolina having tools that would be used as a state. They would be used across the state. Not each of the districts develops their own tools. They could develop complementary tools, but not. It would not. Dr. Evans, it was not the intention. It would be each district develops their own.
That's correct. That it would be across the state.
Yes. And then if you could go to slide 13. I believe
Dr. Dempsey.
Yes.
Dr. Dempsey, sorry, this is Randy. Could we go back to the prior slide?
Yes.
I'm just curious about one aspect. Is InTask just pedagogy, or does it not also provide information about content?
Yes. I mean, the InTask standards intersect with content. To answer your question in a short sentence.
And I'm not that familiar with InTask, so I was just curious if is there a reason why we're only allocating it here for pedagogy and not content as well?
I don't think that's the intent of it being there, because across the recommendations, the in-task standards and the progression model will appear in multiple places. And so I do not, I can say from preparation and injury that I do not believe that was the intent, was to be that isolated, that it would speak more broadly. It would sort of undergird more broadly the framing of practice at the licensure levels.
Okay. So does that speak to any, yeah, I guess what I'm asking is, based on that, is what's reflected in the slide consistent with the intent?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yes, I just heard your question differently. You're asking basically in task, in terms of the standards and the progression model, is grounded in both content and pedagogy. It is speaking to, it is, yes. But the reference, the way it is inserted in this diagram does not speak to that intersection of content and pedagogy.
Yeah, correct.
Yes.
That's just what I was wondering about.
Yes. I think Dr. Evans, in terms of revising, that probably is eliminating the 2 cells and it becomes 1 cell.
Okay.
And then if we could go to slide 13. By virtue of the September discussions, the subcommittee discussions in between the co-chairs and the discussion we just had, I believe the note has been resolved, at least in terms of how we would finalize the language, which would then render this slide no longer necessary. But I'm just suggesting that we're not there yet. I think, Dr. Evans, those conversations speak to why that note is there. Am I correct on that?
That note is there at the request of the co-chairs of the licensure subcommittee to make it clear why they decided not to choose in particular the qualitative growth review measure.
Yeah. So if there are no questions, if we could move to the next slide on license 2. And I think we can move to the next one, unless there are questions. And we would clarify in this slide, depending on how the disposition of the issue, the reference to TA positions, as we discussed earlier. The 2 or 3, the recommendation in the co-chair discussion was that the recommendation was for that to be 2. Any questions here?
Hey, Dr. Dempsey. I was going to say, I don't know if this is a question or a comment. Maybe it's both. So then that bullet where if you're just talking about the effectiveness data can be collected, does that go back to the question about the specificity of EVOS? I don't remember which slide we were on, but it almost makes it sound like there, actually it doesn't almost, it does say that you can use that for the requirements for a level 4 license. Am I reading that correctly?
Dr. Dempsey, would you like me to answer that?
Well, I mean, yes, let me say this. My understanding of that is that while holding license 2, one could present effectiveness data that could be attained through those measures and forms of evidence we talked about in the previous slide to meet the requirements that would move them to license 4. Dr. Evans, you can please.
That's correct.
Yes.
And so we needed to make sure that that was notated in each of those licenses.
Now that would mean, to go back to the reference to in-task that is now built into the draft, in order to go to license 4, the practical application of that is they would have met the standard of practice across the in-task standards. So you wouldn't, for example, you wouldn't be able to have evidence on 7 of the in-task standards and move to license 4. You've got to be able to present that the effectiveness data would be that comprehensive. I'm sorry, Dr. Evans, I interrupted you.
No, you're good.
Yeah.
Dr. Dempsey, this is Mass, and I have a question again.
Yes.
So at what point would, and I might have just missed this in the slides, at what point is someone who is in a teacher preparation program, would they be considered or required to complete those hours to finish like their residency license? So the way like lateral entry works right now, you have so many years to complete the courses to like finalize your license. And I might have missed it in the slides, but at what point do you have to have those hours finished to be able to move up into a license level?
If I'm hearing your question correctly, the answer to that would, well, first of all, do they spend some period of time in license 1 and some period of time in license 2? And then the answer to that would be determined by the first bullet, which is 2. And so they would have 2 years possible in license 2, 2 years possible in license 1, and they would have a total of 4 years, which would be the equivalent of a typical, the design of undergraduate educator preparation programs, for example, that is it's a 4-year process of becoming a professional. Dr. Evans, I think I answered that correctly. And again, that is assuming that where it says 2 or 3, that becomes 2. If it becomes 3, it would change that time frame.
Okay, that answers my question. My original thought was why 2 versus 3, because I'm just thinking if, someone is coming in to teaching and they're maybe an adult student that has a family and, requirements at school and things like that, it might not be feasible in a 2-year period to finish the education side of those requirements, assuming they have the bachelor's degree, which is required with license 1. That was my why 2 versus the 3 years. And I just didn't see the vocabulary, the wording in the license that said, this is where you would be required to have all of those credits by.
Yes. And Dr. Graham, your point in the chat, yes, the recommendation can be a license term up to 3 years. I do want to point out the licensure committee, as I understand their deliberations, was concerned about the additive process of 3-year elements, for example, that you could be in license 1 for this many years, and license 2 for this many years, and then you might land in license 3 for a bit. And so you end up with an accumulated effect before you get to license 4 of an unintended lengthy amount of time before you got to license 4. But the specific answer to your question is yes, that language could be a recommendation.
And if I could add on, we did talk about in September, you don't have to spend 3 years in each of those license levels, correct? You could do it faster, but the option would be there to have up to that amount of time.
Correct. Yes, and the language, again, from the licensure committee is to land on 2 or to land on 3. And the other, where we land, if we were to use the recommendation in the chat, that would say is a license term up to 3 years. And how that would be resolved. I want to suggest to everybody that we pause for 15 seconds and take a deep breath. Okay, Dr. Evans, if we could. License 3, there's the continued use of the using the following tools language and the reliable and valid methods language.
Dr. Dempsey, this is Randy, and I'm glad we just all took a breath based on what I'm about to ask. I'd like to request that we add to the action items list the further consideration of the criteria we're using with respect to EVOS. And it starts with this slide, but it's not specific to just license 3. It goes on into license 4. And so it may not seem as consequential, perhaps. This is. I mean, these are high stakes things. The way it's stated on this slide right here is that you have to have a 0 or higher EVOS score for the 2 most recent years. And we know that the observed EVOS score is a proxy for true growth, right? It has error in it. And so I'm wondering, like, as a state, as we think about this, what are the implications for introducing this specific criterion? For example, we have data on this. We know if we were to apply this decision rule over the past, however many years to actual teachers in the state, how many would meet this criteria, right? And EVOS is standardized, so we know that it's a sum 0 game, right? Not everyone can meet this criteria. It becomes more kind of apparent when you get up to the license 4 levels, where we start using criteria like having to exceed growth for 3 out of 5 years. And then we can ask questions like, well, how many teachers actually do that? That's a really high bar. And so my question is whether we can add this to the list of action items to maybe give further consideration in terms of how we're using EVOS. And we may even have data that can inform the outcomes of this if we were to apply these decision rules in practice.
Right. Yes. I mean, the answer to your question, can we add it to that list? I just added it.
Thank you.
And Dr. Dempsey, this is Maureen, if I could add some clarification to Dr. Penfield's question.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Penfield. And I think that was an error on the Advancement and Development Subcommittee's part. We did change that for level 4 to go to -2 to 2, which is the current standard for meeting growth in North Carolina on EVOS. If you're between -2 and 2, you are considered to have met growth. And we changed that on level 4, and we inadvertently, it looks like we did not change it on this slide. So that was something that we did discuss at length in the Advancement and Development Subcommittee meetings, though. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up so that we recognize that we had not changed that on this slide as well. But I also just wanted to clarify that for the License 4 teacher, they are also expected to meet growth. They are expected to be between 0 or -2 and 2. They are not expected to exceed growth. The exceeding growth would come in for the advanced credentialed positions. And the reason why they would need to exceed growth in order to be able to go into the advanced credential position is because the expectation would be that those teachers would shift into a leadership role where they would be guiding and mentoring other teachers on how to improve their teaching practice and supporting other teachers in improving their teaching practice. And so we would want the teachers who have figured out how to really work with kids and grow kids and develop kids and meet each one of the diverse learners in their classroom's needs to be the teachers who would be assisting their peers in doing that work as well, so that we're able to elevate the teaching profession from within, and so that we're able to meet the diverse needs of every single kid in each one of our classrooms in North Carolina. And so that's why for the classroom excellence and adult leadership teachers, which are advanced credential beyond the level 4 teacher, those teachers would be expected to exceed growth in order to be eligible to go into those positions.
Do you have language out of the advancement subcommittee that was intended to be used there? And can you can email that to Dr. Evans. We'll have that in the for sharing.
Absolutely, Dr. Dempsey. I will make sure I do that right now.
Right. Thank you. And also, I want to tie that back to a couple of other points relative to the change, a couple of changes in the slide. One, the reliable and valid methods, and then at the top, the using the following tools. The conversations in the September meeting out of the subcommittees, in particular, when I and Bullock met as licensure and prep and entry, is to frame this in the language of having evidence of impact on student learning. And so in that using the following tools, part of this is to create, part of the use of that language was to create a portfolio, little p, loosely defined portfolio of evidence that shows the impact on student learning. That conversation typically will default to EVOS. It does not, EVOS in the future will not necessarily be the tool that North Carolina uses. It also connects to the two comments that were just made about edits, potential edits that would go into this in this language. And so I think in the previous conversations since the September meeting, the consistent focus is on evidence of impact on student learning, which is addressed in the NTAS standards. And then giving flexibility in terms of the forms of evidence that could take. Dr. Evans, I think that summarizes a lot of discussions, but I think that's where this has landed.
Dr. Dempsey, this is Bill Griffin here. I've had some questions in regards to the NISA standards and the language that we currently use with proficient, accomplished, and distinguished. Of course, those are subjective terms by the evaluator, the principal, assistant principal is doing that work. Would there be some professional development that goes back and clarifies each of those standards and what they mean and what they represent? Because I think they have a lot of value on moving forward for this proposed model.
Yes, I don't want to project out too far beyond Pepsi, but I would anticipate that there would be a revisiting and review both of the tools themselves to make sure they're as robust as we need them to be, and then making sure that they're used in reliable and valid ways to provide the kind of data and the kind of information that we're talking about here. I hope that's answering your question.
Dr. Dempsey, as part of our recommendations, could we not explicitly state such a position that is our strong recommendation that something of that nature must occur?
You mean the tool, the review of the tools and how they use? Yes.
Yes, the professional development, making certain that we are investing properly in that space. Otherwise, we leave things up to subjectivity, particularly when you're talking about observations.
Yes. And that was a consistent conversation in preparation and entry, that as we look at these multiple tools that might be used, we had to be confident that the tools were designed in a way that was robust, and then the tools were applied in a way that was robust. And then you had multiple, if you take observational tools, you had multiple observers. You didn't have data points that came from one source. That's a summary of 20 months of meetings, but that was consistent, I think, in preparation and entry. And then, yes, Dr. Graham, to your point. Dr. Evans, I think we can move to slide 17. Note at the top of license 3 in the first bullet, the 5 has been struck, and the recommendation would be 6. And then we would make the parallel edits to the other bullets based on previous discussions. If we can move to the next. If there are no questions, we go to the next. In the remaining slides, some of the remaining slides, we had a recommendation to take information that was in the salary schedule document. We still have the salary schedule document available, but to incorporate information from that into this document. So now it would sit in 2 places.
Dr. Dempsey.
Yeah.
Excuse me, this is Connie. I have a question.
Yes.
Looking at this proposed salary schedule, will this eliminate the salaries that may come from the General Assembly? Is this going to replace that? And how is that going to impact salaries for teachers across the state as it relates to the General Assembly?
You mean if the General Assembly appropriated a salary increase larger than what's in the proposed model?
Yes, I mean, I agree that I love the salary increases. I think teachers need more than even what's on here. I want to make that clear. But my question is this going to be the salary scale across the state? Is this what we're proposing that the General Assembly will adopt, and there will be no longer salary increases from the General Assembly? I'm just worried about how that may be viewed.
Budget and compensation, I mean, I think I know the answer to that.
Mr. Chairman, I can talk about that, Mr. Graham, or Dr. Graham can as well, I believe, but I think it's important that everyone understands that what you see on these salary schedules are before any annual increase from the General Assembly. So you can take any of those numbers. If General Assembly gives a 4 or 5% salary increase, that scale will go up each year, each biennium, whenever. So what you see right now would be the base, what we're proposing. And so any annual increase would be on top of that.
Thank you. And I think the second part of the question, the recommendation is the state of North Carolina adopts this and builds this into the fiscal planning.
Correct.
That's correct. Yep.
And as a person might crosswalk who is currently a teacher between the current salary structure and this salary structure, there would be a hold harmless provision so that a teacher doesn't end up in a lower salary because of the implementation of this salary schedule.
That is also correct.
Okay. Thank you. We'll reference the license 3 column when we get back to the action items at the start of the presentation. And this is summary information from the salary schedule document. If there are no questions, we can move. And if there are no questions, I think we can move. And again, this is from the salary schedule document.
Dr. Dempsey,
Yes.
Bill here. Could you clarify for me on this license as just meeting the requirements that are put forth there wouldn't automatically allow a person to move into that advanced teacher roles for the next two levels? Is that correct? They would have to be chosen or interview, or how would that work for a school?
Yeah, that a person would have met the expectations of this license does not necessarily mean they would then hold the position. That will be determined by the availability of the positions. If I'm understanding your question correctly, same way that a person might have got a master's in school administration, but that does not necessarily put them in a school administrator position. If I'm hearing your question.
Yes, thank you. Just want to make sure that meeting the credentials that are, set forth here didn't automatically guarantee a person of that position moving forward.
Correct. I think, Dr. Evans, we can move forward if there are no questions. And then the final slide, unless there are questions. And the last bullet on that slide points to the previous question. You're not necessarily in a position if you hold the license. So, Dr. Evans, if you would scroll back to the agenda action item, and I'm going to ask people to take a minute just to let the brain rest and pull together thoughts or questions or comments or recommendations you might have in the next segment of the meeting. So the bullets that are on this list are items that came from the September meeting or any conversations that might have occurred where we asked subcommittee co-chairs to clarify something. And some of these have been resolved. I think based on the information we have, they have been resolved. The specific application or administration of those recommendations would be work to be done down the road. But inclusion in the recommendations in some cases may have been handled. I do want to add to this the question that is two questions that came up during today so far today to add to this list. One is the criteria question with respect to EVOS that came up when we were on slide 16, Dr. Penfield. I think that you raised the question and then you added a point in the chat. The second is the one Superintendent Truitt raised about what happens in life for a person in license 1 and license 2, and do they go back to a teaching assistant position, or could they go back to apprentice? Those are two that have come up today that I think we would add to the list. So Dr. Evans, if we could go back to the list, and we will, if it helps us to do the tasks in front of us, I will just go through these one at a time and ask Dr. Evans to help me clarify the intent of the bullet, and if there is anyone on the commission who's been involved in these that to help fill in blanks. The first one is recommend language that came out of the co-chairs of prep and entry and licensure meeting to reconcile some differences that came out of the subcommittee. And one of the components of that was to clarify the affiliation language in license 1 and license 2. And we discussed this when we were in those license discussions a few minutes ago, that the person, there's this two-stage affiliation process. One is the purpose of completing the contract. The person who goes to a school district is taken into a position. They then affiliate with an EPP while they are in those licenses, and that language is currently not clear. And that was also out of the discussions before today. Any questions about that item? And Dr. Evans, in case I missed big, fill in the blanks in that summary.
I think you're good.
Okay. Also want to point out that we can make it more explicit, but in these supports, there is an expectation that there would be a partnership between the district where the license 1, license 2 teacher is employed and an EPP. And that relationship would be framed in the MOU. That is under the support, like in the license 1 section, that's in the supports. And so that language would be clarified for license 1 and license 2 about the affiliation of the teacher and the relationship between the EPP and the PSU.
Dr. Dempsey?
Yes.
Does that go back to the first question I asked in reference to ensuring that there will be enough advanced teachers to support license 1 teachers? Is that what you're making reference to with that?
Yes. Now, I'm going to speak as co-chair of the prep and entry, and then discussions with a few other co-chairs and with budget and compensation. The expectation of the structure is that based on the number of teachers who are in license 1 and license 2, there would be adequate fiscal support to ensure that there are enough teachers in the advanced roles to be able to support the license 1, license 2 appointments. That's what and please budget and compensation, correct me if I'm wrong, but the model would be built on the assumption that those positions would exist.
I guess the reason I keep referring to that question is there are many districts that can't fill classrooms. Right. And when we're looking at this model and you have so many positions that are not filled, how are we going to ensure that these districts will have the adequate amount of people to support the licensed one teachers?
Dr. Dempsey, if I may.
Yes, please.
Dr. Locklear, you're spot on with that comment. This question was brought up multiple times in the Budget and Compensation Subcommittee. And I don't know that we ever landed on a real final explanation, solution, what strategy to address it. But there are some districts that have significant concerns about the ability to have these advanced teachers to support teachers in training because they do have to hire so many alternative entry teachers. There's one of our colleagues that spoke up on every one of our meetings when this came up and spoke specifically of her district and said, we won't be able to do this. We're not going to be able to have these advanced teachers. And I don't know that we ever landed on a solution there. Not to my knowledge that it was resolved in a way that everybody on that committee felt comfortable with it. So there's work to be done in that area.
Thank you. Just to clarify what I understand across the subcommittees and where we are now, there is the assumption. Now, this is assuming that this clears Pepsi, the recommendations clear Pepsi, and then they go on to the State Board of Education, and the State Board of Education holds reasonably close to the same position that Pepsi does relative to the recommendations. To go back to your comment, Dr. Holland, there have to be enough teachers in a given district who have achieved that license to be able to hold those roles. And there has to be fiscal capacity provided by the state of North Carolina to support those educators. Those are the two sort of foundational questions. Am I correct on that?
This is Connie again. That's my concern. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think a lot of times the intent of this whole model was great, but I think sometimes when we start looking at theory and reality, we run into a lot of situations. And I am just really concerned, and I'm in one of those counties where we may not have the capacity to support the licensed ones teachers. We have a lot of classrooms that do not have teachers. And I'm just concerned about how this is going to impact my county as well as some other counties. And not only that, I'm also concerned about, we say that this is not merit pay, but how will that stand up in a legal perspective? I just have several concerns, and I don't mean to be the only one that has these concerns, but I think it's important if we have them to address them now before we move forward.
Yeah, I agree. Can we hold the reference to the merit pay question for either today or at the November meeting to make sure there's clarity on that question? I do want to go back to the previous question and articulate from where I sit as chair and what I understand my responsibility and the responsibility of Pepsi to be. It is to recommend the structure, and there would be an associated fiscal component that goes with that to be able to implement the recommendations that we are making. And obviously, that funding is tied to decisions that would be made by the General Assembly. I want to be careful not to get out ahead of the final decisions Pepsi will make, and I certainly do not want to get out ahead of the Board of Education, State Board of Education. But the I'll talk about the relationship between prep and entry and budget and compensation. As we discussed these kinds of issues in preparation and entry, and it had implications for budget, we made sure to move that information to budget, that if we're going to have this many people in license 1, we've got to be confident that there's going to be funding for this many people in the advanced licenses to be able to support them. And that's part of the recommendation, the recommendations that Pepsi would make. That assumption would be.
This is Bill here. I would echo what Connie is saying. And part of budget and compensation, there were certainly a lot of dialogue about that. We looked at the role in compensation and that model and the amounts there, but there's always certainly questions and concerns about the number of positions to fill. And I think that's where this model has to lend itself to be attractive to recruit and retain our individuals that we currently have. And that's going to be a key movement for us.
Well, if I can ask just for the point of the particular item, the clarify affiliation bullet, I am not hearing disagreement about making those changes to the draft that you would see for the November meeting. The fiscal requirements of this is a separate item concern, and we need to make sure we're clear on what we're recommending relative to the fiscal impact of this. And is that a fair summary? Any objection to that summary? And that would connect, if we can move to the license 3 bullet, that the recommendation or the conversation that led to that bullet was to include in license 3 a step salary increase the way we have built in with the other licenses. That's not currently in the schedule, and we would build those numbers into the schedule for license 3. And I'm also assuming there is not an objection to that. So please, if there's a concern about building that into the salary schedule.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I believe I heard Dr. Graham too. No, I was just going to share that I do believe with budget and compensation, this is something we're going to work on, and it's just the clock ran out. And so I didn't want anyone to think we were ignoring it, but we simply didn't have the time, and so we knew it'd be best because of that just to put that as an unfinished item for the whole commission to work on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right, and at this point, we're not. It would be a November discussion about ultimate confirmation of that. But for now, we're building it into the model as information that would be in the draft. Was there anything out of budget and compensation that was opposed to doing that?
No, sir.
Yeah. So, Dr. Evans, we would add that information as part of the draft under the license 3. The question, the third one, duration of licenses 1 and 2. The discussion this morning, and then items that were in the chat. The language that seemed to resonate was up to 3 years.
Dr. Dempsey, quick question. Would we not add a step salary increase then for license 1 and 2 and not solely for license 3? It seems the way we have it written at present, you're almost penalized for having a license 1 or 2 excuse me, from a compensation standpoint, whereas license 3 and upwards would benefit from a salary increase annually, while the other 2 licenses would not. And that seems unfair.
You mean for the duration of the license, so 3 years?
Right.
Right. So one, I am not hearing objection to the language up to 3 years. Does budget and compensation, people who were on that committee or the commission in general, have an objection to building that into the draft, the license 1, license 2 schedule, salary schedule?
Mr. Chairman, my only question to that, which is fine, you would only go up to a certain number of years on that. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Didn't exceed 3 years.
3 years, there you go, yeah.
License 1 would not go past 3 years on the draft. License 2 would not go past 3 years on the draft. License 3, according to the current draft, would not exceed 6.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question about that, Dr. Dempsey, but it would technically be that person's like 4th, 5th, and 6th year, or 6th, it wouldn't be year 1, year 2, it'd be like year 1, year 2, year 3, and then license 2 would be year 3, year 4, year 5 in those steps, correct?
Yes, with the adjustment that when they move from license 1 to license 2, they move to a different base salary.
Right.
So you're sort of adding on top of a different number if you move to license 2.
I believe, though, it's still the years within that license. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. So as like right now, that statement that was just made is accurate. But I believe now you would be back to, I hate to use the word step 1, but you'd be back to step 1 of license 4 or step 1 of license 3, I believe.
Okay, that was kind of my question also is, so it's the steps within
that
each
exactly
license level.
And I know we're trying to get away from talking about experience or beginning teacher or whatever it may be, but that's really that's the kind of how I equate it.
Okay.
Yes. And can the budget and compensation chairs, once Dr. Evans has built this in the draft, we might ask you to take a look at that just to make sure we are consistent with what budget and compensation was thinking.
Certainly.
Okay. So that would resolve, at least for draft language, the first 3. The 4th, unless there are other questions about the first 3.
So for step salary increase, is that also for 1 and 2?
Yes, in the draft.
Okay.
The 4th item, include in supports for new teachers. The discussion there has been that the reference to the acronym ITSP is a reference to a specific thing that does not exist in that, I do not believe exists in the intended structure. We do have different programs in the state of North Carolina, either at an institutional level, UNC System Office or DPI, or in the case, for example, of some school-university partnerships that work with beginning teachers. And so the reference in this item where we have ITSP in parentheses would be language that says supports for new teachers or supports for beginning teachers, and then putting the ITSP in parentheses. And then you see the notes out to the right. Those are actual programs that exist in North Carolina. The assumption is they are examples of what the new teacher support would look like. Any questions on that one? Thank you, Dr. Evans, for noting that. The next item, the renewal options for license 4. The summary of that discussion, the master's degree and national board certification could be used as renewal options during the time frame you were pursuing either the master's degree and or national board certification. So they could count for renewal while you were engaged in the either professional development or professional learning process tied to those two components. Dr. Evans, that feels overly simplified, but I think that was the basis of the discussion.
I think so. We also noted during that discussion that master's or coursework and national board certification is included in renewal options right now within law or within state board policy. So it would be continuing what has already been done.
Right. Any questions on that one? The next item, identify the NTAS standards and progression to be met at each license level. Assumption that license 1 is the most limited and license 3 is all 10 standards. The basis of that conversation was as a person moved from license 1 to license 2 to license 3, they are attaining and exhibiting evidence of mastery around an increasingly broader set of standards for each license. So license 1 would meet a subset, license 2 would meet a broader subset, license 3 would meet all 3. Would meet all of the NTAS standards. Though the NTAS standards that would be connected to 1, 2, and 3 would need to be determined. But what the recommendation would state is that number 1, they're built on the NTAS standards, and number 2, the progression is an increasing level of complexity given the number of standards at the license level.
Dr. Dempsey, would the subcommittee determine which of those NTAS standards would be associated with each licensure level? Was that some other entity?
There was some discussion in prep and injury, and if there are people on, I know Dr. Penfield was involved in some of those questions. We did not finalize in terms of work that came out of the subcommittee which NTAS standards would be at the different license level, but I think there was consistent articulation that structure that I just talked about is what would be in place. Dr. Penfield, I don't know if you want to say
that's my recollection as well.
If we are able to work with subcommittee co-chairs or go back to those discussions in the minutes to articulate what they would be, we could write them in as proposed subsets to answer your question, Dr. Graham. And we can attempt to do that before November.
Yeah, that would be my suggestion if it comes from that particular subcommittee or the chairs. So that way we have a working document so we know exactly which NTAS standards align with each license level.
Right. And then I'm going to pick that.
Dr. Dempsey, can I add on to that? So it's been a while. And so, yeah, we'll definitely go back. I seem to recall at some point in prep and entry, we talked about rather than maybe different standards being for different licensure levels, that isn't there an in-task like the extent to which you've met certain standards plays a role, in that it was the extent to which that would kind of be mapped onto the different licensure levels.
Right. Yes, there was. Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah, we did have those discussions. Taking both of those comments, and Dr. Graham, your suggestion, we will go back and see how specifically we can pull language that can be shared and discussed at the November meeting about what that structure, in terms of the recommendation. Keep in mind at this point we're making a recommendation, what that would look like. What I'm hearing is, unless there is an objection, that identifying the NTAS standards and progressions, and they would be the foundation of the knowledge base and the evidence of practice for license 1, license 2, license 3. They're already built into EPPs in the sense of the comprehensive standards. The question then becomes the expectation of license 1 and the expectation of license 2. Coupled with, and Dr. Evans, help me make sure my language is representative of the conversations. A person in license 1, and Dr. Penfield, this gets back to the points you just made, a person at license 1 meeting a subset of the standards would be expected to meet that standard at a level that would be consistent with what we would expect at license 3. Now, this, Dr. Penfield, gets back to the progression on all of them versus developing deeper expertise on a subset. That there has to be a standard of practice expectation in license 1 and license 2 that has to be ultimately has to be articulated. Be that a recommendation by Pepsi and or the State Board of Education. But that standard of practice would need to be determined for the NTAS standards. Dr. Evans, that was also a part of that conversation that
yes, with Dr. Bullock.
Yeah, that we thought was important to that item. And so back to Dr. Penfield's point, we would have to, the state, whether it be that Pepsi State Board asking Pepsi or a broader stakeholder group of educators to frame that out more specifically, that in task is the base. There's an expectation of meeting those standards at 1, 2, and 3. And then there's an expectation of the level of practice around those standards. That is part of that infrastructure. And we will see more language on that in November. The bullet add valid with measures, that language has been incorporated across the document. There's probably some clarifying editing to do in terms of its, how it's built in, but we saw that when we went through the draft. Any questions or comments on the validated with measures incorporation? The next item, language around requirement options for measures. You saw that. Complete one of the following has been replaced with using the following tools. That change has actually been written into the document. Are there any questions or things to be clarified about that? The next item, progression of the cumulative nature of measures, that is in part related to the in-task, the use of the in-task standards and the progression that we just talked about. Dr. Evans, the other pieces of that particular item, can you help me remember those?
Dr. Bullock had raised the question around if you, say for instance, you meet content with the assessment but you're at license 1, say, going to license 2, but then you pass that test according to what you would need to meet for license 3. Do you skip license 2 requirement for that exam? Could you utilize that exam to get to license 3, even though you're working towards license 2?
Yes.
But you reach the license 3 threshold to pass that measure.
Yes. Once you had provided evidence of a measure, you didn't have to go back and provide it again. But I think that was Dr. Bullock's.
Yes.
Yes. Content was the example she used. Once you have shown you have provided evidence in license 2 of having met the content standard, you don't, and then you're in license 3, hypothetically at some point, you don't have to do it again. Any questions or comments on that? And then the last item in this list before we go to the additions from today, and I do appreciate people's fortitude with this, the micro-credential component and whether or not micro-credentials may be an element in license 1, 2, and 3. The concern was the appropriateness of using micro-credentials in licensure areas prior to license 4. The summary of the discussion is that micro-credentials could be used as an option in license 1, license 2, and license 3, including by EPPs, should they choose to use them, or by partnerships between EPPs, school districts, partnerships between EPP, school districts, community colleges, but the basic idea of a partnership, that micro-credentials could play a role in those licensure areas if they, number one, assuming the micro-credential has been approved by the State Board of Education in the same sense that the State Board of Education has that function now. It is grounded in the in-task progression model as appropriate to the license and meets a standard of practice that we would expect to be consistent with license 3. So that a person can do a micro-credential in license 1 and is specific to a component, a pedagogical component, and that can be done through micro-credentials, but it has to meet the expectation that we would expect to see to clear license 3 for a specific micro-credential area. And so those were the parameters that Ann Bullock and I discussed around at how would micro-credentials be an appropriate tool used by EPPs and or in license 1 and 2.
This is Catherine. May I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, so when we're talking about the micro-credential, and you mentioned just now, Dr. Dempsey, all of the various combinations in which that micro-credential could be offered. Is there currently a scenario where the micro-credential could be earned separately from or exclusive to the and without being in partnership with an EPP? So in other words, could just the PSU offer the micro-credential that would then lead to licensure?
As determined in the MOU, I mean, that if you have an MOU between parties, a school university partnership, school district, and the EPP, and their MOU includes the conditions for that. This question has come up in other venues. It got asked differently in a meeting I was in last week. Could a person who's in license 1 or 2 or license 3 for that matter, and in an EPP, could they go off and take a micro-credential through their own choice? I'm going to go do this micro-credential over here, and it's going to serve as evidence of my readiness for credentialing. The answer in that conversation last week was no, because it has not been approved as an element. So micro-credentials, like any other component, would need to be subjected to the vetting process that we have for programs or preparation for licensure now. So to your point, Superintendent Truitt, I'm trying to think of the right word. It can't be ad hoc-ish. I mean, I think I'm trying to summarize the conversation.
Right.
It can't be you go out on the open marketplaces of micro-credentials and gather enough of them to claim a license. The process has to be articulated, and the approval of appropriate micro-credentials has to be confirmed. Currently, that is done, if we think about what happens in preparation programs that we have now, that is done by the State Board of Education.
Okay, so if I have a baccalaureate degree and I want to participate in a residency license program, can I obtain that residency license with micro-credentials only and not affiliate with an EPP, but through a PSU?
Well, I don't want to say not. According to the language that is in the MOU. So if you go back to those license 1, license 2 areas, it talks about the relationship between EPPs and districts and references the existence of MOUs. Those MOUs would need to be confirmed, drafted and confirmed between those potential partners. Speaking to the language that's in the document.
Dr. Dempsey?
Yes.
Well, one additional question. The micro-credentials they have to be approved by the state, but can they be different from district to district? Can each district have their own separate micro-credential? I guess the reason I'm asking goes back to my question earlier.
For CEUs, not for effectiveness.
Pardon me?
They could have, I'm sorry, Dr. Dempsey, if you wanted to answer this. So micro-credentials would be able, so if a district wanted to create their own micro-credentials for CEU purposes, for renewal purposes, but for the effectiveness purpose, that would need to be something standardized across the state.
Okay, that was my question, because my concern was, it's not that I'm against micro-credentials as a way for licensure. It's just that my concern is what happens if a teacher is working on this micro-credential within in this district, and then he or she moves to a different district and they have a different micro-credential. Will they have to start the process all over again?
For the purposes that Dr. Evans just noted, but to reduce it to licensure only if let's say UNC Wilmington and a consortium of school districts develops a set of micro-credentials. those micro credentials as part of our programming would be reviewed and approved or not by the State Board of Education, assuming the process looks similarly to what we do now. And because the confirmation of that micro credential sits in the license, it sits in the license. So if a person leaves New Hanover County and goes to Bertie County, the confirmation of that license is still in place. Although they might have done the micro credentials, same thing with, think about it as coursework. The assumption is that if UNCW's program includes coursework and field experiences that have been approved by the State Board of Education, although that is situated at UNC Wilmington and our school-university partnership, a teacher can go anywhere in the state and that license is valid. That license and its components are approved by the state of North Carolina. So they don't have to go to another district and start over if they've cleared the license. I think I'm Kim, correct, Dr. Evans, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but at the level of licensure, it's a state decision holding the license.
Right. That's correct.
I understand the process. I just want to make sure that teachers do not leave one district working on this micro-credential that's approved by that district and then move to another district who does not honor what they've already done and they've got to start all over again.
I mean, we can clarify that, Dr. Evans, we can make a note to clarify that before November, but that transferability would need to be in place. And that would in part sit on the fact that districts cannot, districts or universities or anybody else cannot go out and independently start producing micro credentials. And there's a marketplace of these and you go buy them and bundle them together into clearing a certificate. All of that sits within a structure that has to be reviewed and approved by the State Board of Education. So there are, and I would advocate as a dean and as an educator, there's got to be a process for confirming the credibility and integrity of those micro credentials. And that I don't believe that can be localized. That has to come under the authority of the State Board of Education. I could be wrong. I'm totally wrong on that. That's how I would see that working. But let's try to make sure that's one of our items to clarify by November. Writing a note down to sure we do that. So are there any other questions about that last bullet, the micro credentials being used in license 1? It is not a statement that they must be used in license 1, 2, 3. It's a statement that they may be used under those conditions. But then the 3 items from the earlier discussion, and please help me if I missed items. One is the criteria being used with respect to EVOS. The second is if you're moving back and forth in license 1 and 2, you land in apprentice, not a teaching assistant position. And then clarity on the fiscal requirements. That the assumption is the components of the structure of the model would be funded. That there would be appropriation decisions made to fund the structure. And
Dr. Dempsey,
yes.
Dr. Dempsey, this is Randy. Just real quick, I want to make sure that we're addressing Dr. Graham's earlier comment, and maybe the prior conversation did all that in terms of using micro-credentials in lieu of a more traditional EPP route, which we know is highly productive. Have we covered everything that Dr. Graham was addressing? And I ask because I know that was a topic that was also, in terms of pathways and routes, that was noted by some of the other input that we received to the committee.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Benfield. I think it kind of connects back to Superintendent Truitt's question, and I'm still not entirely clear, because what I understood from Superintendent Truitt's question, which was a good one, I think, was if a school district decides to offer micro-credentials independent from an educator preparation program, would it be allowed to do so? Which then would not have the ed prep program involved or engaged in the process of preparing an individual to enter the classroom, where research data show clearly that individuals who move through ed prep programs have a much more significant impact on student learning. So are we creating a structure that allows for a lot of flexibility, where we might be producing and preparing more licensed teachers, but does that equate to more effective teachers relative to student learning? And that's where I'm still a little fuzzy and lack clarity. And quite honestly, I would have concern.
From my read of the document, well, say two things. Number one is let me say what's in the document first. The reference that is in the document in License 1 and License 2 for the definition in MOUs between the PSUs and the EPPs. So that support system, that statement, in my interpretation of the document, says for a person who is working in a district in License 1 and License 2, there is an affiliation for that teacher with an EPP under an MOU with the district. And then the MOUs would outline those components that would be available to teachers who were in License 1 and License 2. Same way we would do that now in EPPs, where we have those relationships articulated in university-based educator preparation. And so number one, where I land on that question is that is an expectation of that support component, that would be clarified in the partnership. And neither part, I mean, in an authentic partnership agreement that has integrity, it isn't just the school district goes off and says, well, we want to do micro-credentials this way. The university or the community college or the partner would also not be able to go out and say, well, you know, we've traditionally done this way in partnership with the school district. We're just going to go do it over here without any involvement from the district. I mean, I would think that partnership, that MOU is going to define that. And that's why I think that bullet is important under License 1 to License 2. The second piece of this I was going to say was, if we need to write clarifying language, then please submit that. And that would need to be reviewed when we get to the November draft.
No, that's helpful. Thank you, Dr. Dempsey.
So if you could, you know, it's always bad when someone asks a question to put work back on them, but framing that concern in a recommendation that addresses that concern, if that makes sense.
Got it.
In my individual point of view on this, and I recognize I'm saying this as the chair, access to the knowledge base, whether it be through traditional EPPs, it be through what we currently call residency, it could be through, in the future, what we call License 1, License 2, as an element of our responsibility to the state of North Carolina. This micro-credentials, but any aspect of this, it can't be go out in the open market and find whatever you can find that you can then say, I've met that standard. it has to be subjected to the processes that the state of North Carolina would expect that we understand traditionally in approval through the state board for what would be appropriate within those pathways.
This is Catherine again. To your point, we do have a couple of PSUs that are authorized by the board to license teachers. So I think back to what Dr. Graham and I are I think in agreement on our fuzziness here, is that it does seem as though, even though I agree with you, Dr. Dempsey, that it's very clear that there cannot be an ad hoc. I mean, that's what we're trying to get rid of, right? Is this ad hoc approach to collecting a license or the components of a license. But I do think that the way the recommendations read now, it does appear to be possible that someone who holds a 4-year degree could not engage with an educator prep program at the university level and obtain a teaching license. And we need to remember also that our community colleges now can offer to those with a 4-year degree already, they will be able to, as per legislation, offer a license as well. And I think that it would be worth. We know for sure that when we talk about teachers being better prepared and students having better outcomes when their teacher has been prepared by a traditional EPP, I'm not sure if that research is comparing EPP grads to those who were teaching on the 3-year license before, who never affiliated with an EPP or got a teaching license and then their license expired, or is that comparing teachers to those who went through a PSU program that was approved by the State Board of Education?
Dr. Graham, I'm going back to creating labor. You ask a good question and the response is to create labor for you. Can you draft for review for us to see in the next draft what that recommendation language would look like that would frame, it would take it out of the language of the concern is into the recommendation that. I know I just asked you that a few minutes ago, but I can't remember your answer.
Certainly, that's not a problem.
Yes, and then we can build that in for November. Someone was going to say something. So we have Dr. Evans, we need to include that in the items for November. The license 1, license 2 going back to apprentice. And Dr. Truitt, I don't want to. Can you phrase that in the form of a recommendation now, or would you rather send that to us for consideration? I think I anticipate what your recommendation might be, but
in terms of whether or not someone, if the affiliation, let me back up. Are you asking if I can formulate a recommendation as it pertains to this question of whether or not someone can get licensed without affiliating with an EPP?
Well, that one too, if you would like to offer language for consideration. I had jumped over to the apprentice question, that when a person is in license 1, license 2.
Oh, sorry.
And they step back, it's not to a teaching assistant position, it's to an apprentice position.
Yes, I can do that. Thank you.
Okay. And keep in mind, as I'm sure many on the call know, the differences between teaching assistant positions and potentially apprentice positions may open doors to other questions, but at least for the purposes of Pepsi's responsibility, we can articulate the recommendation. The third one was the question about the use of EVOS. And by the way, we do not have to resolve these today. I'm being mindful of time, but the ones that seem to be more close to resolution, we can certainly do that. The question about EVOS, can the people who raised that question tell us again sort of how we're framing what the potential issue to be resolved is?
Dr. Dempsey, this is Randy. I'm happy to start us off. That would be useful.
Yes.
So it's a question I pose in terms of the criteria that are used with EVOS across the different licensure levels. What is the justification, and do we have we explored, and if we have, the extent to which what the consequences will be of doing this, and does it align with our intention? I'll give a couple examples. I believe, if I'm understanding things right, at license 2 and 3, the criteria that's currently stated is that you have to have an average EVOS score of 0 or higher for the 2 most recent years. So you take your 2 most recent EVOS, you average them, and then if that's greater than 0, then then you're good. If not, then then you that score does not serve you in this process. But then it changes when you get to license 4, I believe, because then it shifts to demonstrate effectiveness. So I believe that's through meeting expected growth for 3 of 5 years. Those are different because an EVOS score of negative 0.5 does not meet the threshold of 0, so it wouldn't count for licensure 2 and 3, but it does meet the criteria, if I understand things right, for meeting growth. So I don't have an answer to this. I'm just wondering whether we can take a step back and look at, if we were to implement these criteria, what would be the implications? How many teachers for license 2 and 3 would not be successful via these criteria using EVOS? And what are the implications for that? And is that the intended purpose here? Is it meeting what we're intending this use of EVOS to do? And then I think the same with the meeting expected growth for 3 of the last 5 years. Is that doing what it's supposed to be doing? And so part of where this is coming from is I think we have data on this. And so is it possible for us to take a step back and look at this and evaluate the extent to which these criteria are meeting our intended purposes? Let me stop there.
Can I ask a follow-up question for clarity? Is your concern about EVOS in particular, or the type of tool EVOS represents, or both?
I think they're intermixed. EVOS has error in it. It's a statistical model, right? So by definition, it's going to have error in it. And so there's that part of it that I think we want to be really careful when we're using measures like this for these types of very high stakes decisions. On top of that, though, just to give you an example of what's catching my eye is, I could be off, but I think that the criteria that's set forth for license 2 and 3 is actually more stringent than for license 4. I think it's actually harder to have an average EVOS of 0 over 2 consecutive years than to meet growth for 3 of 5 years. Is that the intention?
So, Dr. Penfield, is it okay if I respond to this, Dr. Dempsey?
Please. Yes.
So, Dr. Penfield, Ms. Stover, she noted that that was a mistake, that it should be meets expectations. So it should be -2 to 2. It should be the range. It shouldn't be more stringent than license 4. So that was just advancement and development. They just skipped making that change. That was just missed. So that's that qualifying score correction for license 2 and 3. That's what I'll correct there.
And so, thanks. That's really helpful. And so then I guess I would still pose the same question to the committee, and maybe the subcommittee can fill in the justification on it. Does moving to that, does it meet the intended use? I certainly have much less concern hearing that change, and I'd misinterpreted when that was specified earlier. So I don't know Dr. Dempsey, where this goes, other than I think that if we're setting a standard of 3 out of 5 years, just for example, right? Why? What's the justification for that?
Dr. Dempsey, do you want me to take that question since I did advancement and development?
Yeah. Please, and let me also add. I've got an echo now. Go ahead, Nat. Yeah, I think. Please go ahead with the response.
Okay, thanks. So, Dr. Penfield, so I think the intention here is twofold. First of all, we do want to ensure that before a teacher would move to the next licensure level, that they have acquired competency in the level that they're currently in. So that's where the 3 to 5 years piece came in, so that we give them adequate time to develop those skills and adequate time to be able to demonstrate those competencies before they move to the next licensure level. If they finish it in 3 years, then they would be able to move to the next licensure level quick. If they need all 5 years, they would be afforded those 5 years to be able to continue working on those competencies. I think another really important thing to note here as well is that we would not be expecting the teachers at any level, from apprentice level through level 4, none of those teachers would be expected to be able to develop those competencies and improve their teaching practice on their own. They will be fully supported by the adult leadership and the classroom excellence teachers that are in their school. And those teachers will have been trained and will have the required ability to be able to help other people in the teaching profession to improve their ability to maximize their potential with students, right? So we're not going to be putting them into a position where we're expecting them to figure this out on their own. If they're not meeting that growth expectation, then there's going to be somebody there who's working with them. And it's not going to be after they find out that they didn't meet growth. It's going to be continuously throughout the year. There will be somebody who's looking at how they're doing, looking at some of the different targets that they're trying to reach, helping them with their goals, helping them understand how to use data to inform instruction. There'll be somebody with them walking through that process with them who will be specifically there to help them to ensure that they are meeting growth. So, really what this model is looking at doing is fully supporting our teachers in their practice so that they are able to fully support their students in their learning.
Thanks, that's helpful. I have a follow-up question. Is there one of the license for categories that is where it is needed to exceed growth for 3 out of 5 years?
Yes. So for the classroom excellence and for the adult leadership teacher, those teachers will need to exceed growth for 3 out of 5 years. And the reason for that is those are the teachers who will be receiving additional compensation for the work that they are doing in mentoring roles and the work that they're doing with their colleagues in their building. So if we're going to pull teachers to be working with other people in their building, we want to make sure that they are the teachers who have demonstrated year after year that they are able to exceed growth with students, and then they're able to share that expertise with their colleagues. As we were developing and having our discussions in the Advancement and Development Subcommittee, we really understood that the best people to help inform how to be better teachers are teachers. The people who are doing the work every day, the K-12 practitioners who are in their classrooms every day, who are making magic happen with students, those are the best people to help their colleagues be able to figure out what are the elements that really make that happen. Like, how do you reach all the learners in your classroom? How do you design instruction to meet the needs of multiple diverse learners in your room? How do you use data to inform your instruction? So what we would do with those adult leadership teachers who have exceeded growth and have figured out how to do that with their kids, this model utilizes their expertise so that they are then able to help their colleagues develop those skills.
That makes sense to me. And do we have data on how many teachers would currently actually meet that criteria, or that criterion of exceeding growth 3 out of the last 5 years, and how that's distributed across the state in different districts?
Dr. Evans, get that.
Can you repeat that, Dr. Penfield?
Yeah. So for license 4, with respect to EVOS, for several of the classifications, the way it's laid out now is that you would have your EVOS score would have to exceed growth 3 out of the last 5 years. And so I'm curious about how frequently does that happen? What percentage of our current teachers would actually meet that threshold? And then I think there's a follow-up question, which is now how is that distributed across our state, across our districts, across our schools with varying levels of resourcing?
For license 4, it was corrected to meets expected growth for demonstrating effectiveness for EVOS. Because I believe there was discussion within subcommittees about that.
So
Maureen, it would be the meets expected growth range, not exceeds.
Kim, I believe he's asking about for classroom excellence and adult leadership.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All of those you would need to exceed growth.
I'm sorry. Yes. Yes. I'm so sorry.
And Dr. Penfield, you're asking, do we have that analysis? And I'm assuming if we don't, can we give it?
That is something that I would need to look into.
Okay.
Great, thanks. I apologize to the committee for holding us up. Part of where this is coming from is I know these are high standards.
And Dr. Penfield, if I could just make one point of clarification as well. This is not only going to be based on EVOS. So the classroom excellence and adult leadership teachers would also be able to demonstrate that they have exceeded growth using the other tools that will be developed. So this will not just be EVOS teachers who are able to move into those roles, and it will not only be EVOS that is being considered. This model really gives teachers the choice on how they would be able to demonstrate their effectiveness with students. So they could use EVOS if they choose to. We are federally mandated to give standardized tests. And so teachers who are in EVOS tested areas will get the EVOS growth scores back. So, they will get those scores. We wanted to leave that in there as an option, but we were very clear in the Advancement and Development Subcommittee at making sure that there would be multiple options for teachers to demonstrate their effectiveness with their students. So really what we're looking at when we talk about effectiveness is a student better on day 180 than they were on day 1 because of the teacher they had? And so we're giving teachers an option of ways to demonstrate that and to show that, yes, the work that I do with my kids every day is making them better students. And here's how I can demonstrate that. And that's why we've added in some of the different measures that we'll be using the different tools that we'll be using to measure that effectiveness, so that teachers have an option on how they're showing that their students have grown in their classroom.
Thanks, Maureen. Appreciate that. And yep.
Are there other questions or comments on this discussion? And thank you for raising the question in the discussion.
Dr. Dempsey, I do have a comment about some of the comments that Maureen brought up. So I guess my thought is, coming from the classroom, who's going to hold these the adult, the higher level teachers accountable for providing those supports? Because I know a lot of times, we get a lot of things that trickle down and it say there will be support for this, there's going to be support for this, and it ends up turning into just one more thing for a classroom teacher to do, right? And so my thought is how do we ensure that those supports actually happen? If a teacher genuinely is struggling to get from that level 2 to level 3 or level 1 to level 2, where is the accountability for those higher level teachers that are supporting those, level 1 and level 2 teachers? And then where is the additional support, just the accountability piece of it, I guess, is what I'm getting at. As being in the classroom, we hear a lot of, there will be support for this, there will be support for this. And unfortunately, many times it doesn't actually show up. And so I'm afraid we're, putting these more experienced teachers in these levels and wanting them to help and do additional things that they're not going to be necessarily held accountable for, because their plate is just as overloaded as the level 1 or the level 2 teacher. And I'm just kind of throwing that out there.
Yeah, Madison, thank you so much and thank you so much for elevating that. That's definitely a really important point, and something that I did not bring up when I was having the previous comments that I made. So the adult leadership teacher's job will shift from working predominantly with students as a classroom teacher to working predominantly with adults. So they will no longer be a teacher that is assigned students. They will be working with adults in their building all day long. So one of the things that came up in some of our advancement and development meetings was there would need to be a metric that's developed where that teacher, as opposed to being measured on their growth with students, would be measured on their growth with the colleagues that they're working with. So that would be the accountability piece for them. And a lot of that is going to be part of the implementation. And I know that there's been some discussion back and forth about the difference between when we're talking about the policy change and talking about the implementation phase. And really the difference between that is right now we are looking at changing kind of the broad umbrella skeleton of what currently exists in policy and statute around teacher licensure. And if that is approved, then we would move into designing all the specific pieces and really building out the specific tools and how everything will look exactly. All of that work will be piloted. All of that work will be done with classroom teachers and will be done so that classroom teachers are involved in every step of designing those tools, designing those expectations, and designing the way that that will look. But if the policy is not passed by Pepsi, the state board, and or the General Assembly, then putting in all that work in the forefront would be a massive amount of time and money that if the policy isn't passed, we wouldn't have, that work would have been done for naught. And so that's kind of the difference between the policy piece and the implementation piece. So, but there will be accountability for those teachers. We do fundamentally understand. I am also a classroom teacher. I'm a high school science teacher. So I fully understand the asking teachers to take on additional duties and asking teachers to fill their plates, especially when they're trying to do a million other things, is unfair to teachers, and that's not realistic. And that's why that classroom or the adult leadership teacher would not be working predominantly with students. They'd be working predominantly with adults. Now, they will still be in classrooms every single day. So their expertise will be extending to the students of the teachers that they're working with. They will also have an opportunity to co-teach, to model teach, to assist teachers with polling, like maybe small group or working with teachers to help support students who need some additional help. So they will still be working with students. They will still be in classrooms every day, but they will not be assigned the typical kind of roster of students that they would be like today. The classroom excellence teacher would have their room open to do model teaching. They would also probably be the teachers who are working with pre-service teachers. They would be the teachers who would be maybe department chairs or who would be the sit chair. So they would be taking on additional leadership roles, and their stipend would be to acknowledge that they are taking on those additional leadership roles and that they are supporting and working with other teachers in their building. But those teachers would still be assigned students.
Thank you. I think that clarifies that accountability piece. So I guess then my question would be, most of our schools have lead teachers or a curriculum person who should be kind of already doing this position. So if someone is already in a role like that, would they then have to meet those requirements to remain on that level, or would these potentially be additional positions to offer in a school building?
Another great question. Thank you. And so some of that would be part of the implementation, but when we say that a lot of our schools already have those positions, we do have many schools that do have those positions, but we also have many schools that do not. And so by making this a state level standard that every school would have adult leadership teachers and would have classroom excellence teachers, that is an equity issue for some of our schools that currently cannot fund those positions, because now that those would be state allocated positions and they would be state funded positions. So that means that every school in the state would have the advantage of having the classroom excellence and the adult leadership teachers who would be able to support the teachers in their building. We haven't really discussed, because it's part of the implementation, how it would look if you're currently like in a coaching role or a curriculum director role or doing some kind of leadership role at your school. That would obviously be something where we will be connecting with teachers who are currently in those roles as the implementation phase begins, to really understand what is the best way to transition those people that are currently in those roles onto the new licensure plan if it does in fact pass Pepsi, the state board, and then the General Assembly.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you both. Any comments to wrap up that or questions to wrap up that particular topic?
One quick question, Dr. Dempsey, and I guess it's more of an observation, I suppose, than a question. And it's something Maureen said several times, and I think it's part of the tension of this work. To what extent should Pepsi really give attention to the implementation science of this framework? What I continue to hear is, the idea is to present the parameters, the concept, and so forth. And then once approved, we will then move and transition to the implementation piece of it. And I worry that if we don't pay attention to the implementation component to some extent now, then we could be presenting a concept where bits and pieces of what we're presenting would be cherry picked, and we would be asked to move in that direction because we didn't give sufficient attention up front to the implementation science of it. So I guess I'm talking aloud here, but I am somewhat worried about the tension of getting a model conceptually presented, and then we move to thinking about the implementation as opposed to thinking about the implementation concurrently with the conceptualization of the model. And I am worried about that and what it could lead to downrange.
I hear your concern. I'm not. I guess it doesn't sit with me at this point as concern in the same way. My understanding of the process by which Pepsi makes recommendations to the state board, in particular in a case like this when it's a complex set of recommendations, that the state board, I mean, we've seen from other things that Pepsi has done, the state board, first of all, it has not cleared Pepsi, so I want to acknowledge that we are not yet at a point where it has left Pepsi, and I don't want to get out ahead of the membership's decision. Should it be forwarded from Pepsi, then the State Board of Education, as I understand the process, reviews it in its entirety. Not, we like 0.3.2, but not these, and so we're taking this part out, but not that part out. That is not the nature of the process. When the State Board of Education has had an opportunity to review this based on previous activity between Pepsi and the State Board, the State Board could then ask Pepsi to do the developmental work. And I would hope that they would, that the State Board would come back to Pepsi around the kinds of components that you're talking about that would take operational steps. So how do we translate something from a recommendation or structure for recommendation into the operational state that it would take on? And at that point, Pepsi would engage, I think, as was referenced earlier, the appropriate stakeholders and practitioners that would be able to best inform how we take a recommendation and structures within this from recommendations into how the state of North Carolina would operationalize that under the authority of the state board and in, to the degree that the General Assembly would be involved in those, because we know many pieces of this sit in state law, not in policy. And so we would have to work with the General Assembly. We have also done that in activities of Pepsi. So I hear you. I'm not rebutting the concern that we would have to work closely with the State Board of Education as they respond to what we recommend. I don't want to assume the State Board of Education is going to take what we send them and say yes. State Board will be they will do their own review, and I respect that. But Dr. Graham, I hear you. I'm not dismissive of the concern.
Dr. Dempsey, this is Catherine. Can I add a little wrinkle to that, please?
Sure.
So I appreciate Dr. Graham's concerns for many reasons, and I don't disagree with you, Dr. Dempsey, except to say that because of the time frame that we find ourselves in, that once this passes out of the state board as a cohesive set of recommendations, that the legislature will then take this up. There will not, if we want to have any action occur in the long session, there will not be time for the state board, which is essentially the Department of Public Instruction doing the work, to work with Pepsi. What we need to advocate for is that the legislature drafting staff will work with Pepsi and other stakeholders to create or they could direct the state board to work with Pepsi to work on the implementation piece. But we're, bills are going to start, bills will start coming in December. And so we will be, our time is not going to be our own. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So I would just ask everyone to, in their advocacy, to want the General Assembly to partner with Pepsi as they are drafting the recommendations that we sent.
Yes. I agree, and I totally agree, Superintendent. And once this is out of Pepsi's hands, it moves to the next part of the process. I think it is, I certainly as chair, will do this and hopefully with the support of the Pepsi membership, we're then working with the state board, state superintendent, and ultimately the General Assembly to start to do the design work to put elements of this that are favorably received in place. And that while back to your point, Dr. Graham, and I think the conversation we just had about EVOS is critical. Ultimately, the General Assembly can be a more autonomous actor than any of us can be. I want to make sure, to follow up the superintendent's point, I want to make sure that we have given our best effort to defining the elements of this within the time frame and the charge that we have, and then be as consistent in my part as chair to articulate to the state superintendent, to the state board chair, and potentially to the General Assembly that Pepsi wants to be a partner in the further development of this work. And that is, I have that as an expectation, given the history of the work that Pepsi has done with the state board and the General Assembly, that in the state superintendent's office over the number of years we've been in existence, that would happen. State superintendent raises a good point. Timing is not only up to Pepsi for action on any part of this, because there are other autonomous actors in this process. But I believe Pepsi and our ability to convene critical stakeholders and practitioners to further develop this work is an important part of the work as it moves forward.
And I will be advocating for the same thing, Dr. Dempsey.
Thank you. I will also add at this point, at least in conversation, because now that being in the chair's role, that I anticipate there will be an effort to collaborate. I think that is my sense of the long-term direction of being able to further refine and then put these recommendations in place. But I just totally understand and appreciate the concern and my responsibility to be mindful of it. It is 11:54, and with the goal of ending this meeting by noon, I want for Ms. Evans to check me. We have 3 items that have come out of the last set of discussions. One is related to the language, the resolution of the language around the use of EVOS in the model, per the discussion that we just had. The second is the micro-credentials role in making sure we are as clear as we can be in the intention of Pepsi for the use of micro-credentials. The third is the relationship between License 1 and License 2 and being able to go back and land in an apprentice license in the event that the person doesn't clear License 1, License 2. The fourth, which we can take up in the November meeting, is the fiscal impact of this and understanding and making sure that we are recommending that the things that need to be fiscally supported are supported for the structure to work. And I think those were the 4, I think I said 3. I think those were the 4 major items in the last hour.
That sounds right to me.
Anyone have a compelling need to offer a comment before I close the meeting?
I think this goes along with what you said, Dr. Dempsey. It's Connie again. I apologize. But going back to the concern of staffing, I'm wondering if that's embedded in one of those questions somewhere.
Yes, is the fiscal, yes.
Thank you.
Yes, the fiscal impact note. I want to thank everybody for the stick-with-itness and energy and attention that has gone into the meeting today. This is we have been methodical and mindful and intentional about how we have had these conversations, different parts of the conversation today. And as chair and as an educator and as a citizen of North Carolina, I totally and thoroughly appreciate that. And we have done good work on behalf of the commission and on behalf of public education and education generally and children in North Carolina. So thank you for what you have brought to the discussion today. And I am confident in the meeting that we will have in November. I also want to thank the folks at DPI, in particular, Dr. Evans, who helps to orchestrate being able to get this language into the document, and how she helps with me as chair in between the meetings to make sure we're reflecting what the membership of Pepsi has asked for in the draft. Given that there are no other comments, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Anthony Grant.
Thanks, sir.
Connie, second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed? Our next meeting, Thursday, November the 10th, 9 to 12. I would anticipate at this point that we will exhaust the time available to us in that meeting. And that will be a meeting that I am sure will be as robust and important as the one that we had today. So thank you all. And I appreciate your energy, and the meeting is adjourned.